My name is Amy Burke. I am the lead steward of BGI Europe Seminars. And often when I'm teaching, we get these questions that are just fabulous because they're not a question about the work. They're about how to incorporate the understanding, the language, the approach of BGI with what people already do in practice. And this last weekend, I was teaching in Barcelona, and we had two Sophies at our seminar who practice upper cervical. And both of them were really interested in finding out if there were other people in the BGI world that were combining an upper cervical approach through the BGI framework or through the BGI lens. And I was so excited to be able to say, not only do we have someone, but we have a BGI master. We have Carolyn Fancher, who is one of my favorite people in the BGI community. I adore her. She's brilliant. She's amazing. She's so skilled and so humble with her wisdom and knowledge. Carolyn graduated from Palmer College of Chiropractic. She met Sue like the weekend before she was about to start chiropractic college, as she also met Roy Sweat, who became her upper cervical mentor. And she spent a year with him in his practice in Georgia after she graduated. Roy Sweat is the person who developed the Atlas Orthagonal specific tool, which Carolyn does use amongst other things in her practice, but all through the lens of biogeometric integration. So it was a total delight for me to facilitate this conversation between Sophie Anderson, who practices in Barcelona, and Carolyn Fancher, who practices in West Seattle. They are both fabulous, and you will enjoy every minute. Our BGI community globally is blessed with the most amazing people, and I'm so excited to share them with you.
Margaritas are my favorite thing. Oysters and margaritas.
Perfect.
Oh, I love you.
She's great. She's great. She and other Sophie are great. They're so fun and lovely, and yeah.
Yes.
I'm excited to see your office, Carolyn.
Yeah. Introduce people to the idea of how an upper cervical doctor is paying attention to overall geometry. So it starts to bring the conversation together of what we're really looking at, and how upper cervical is actually a great example of how we look at the whole body's geometry.
Like this week, I've just been doing it, and actually it's way less complicated than I thought. Like there was a lot of questions like, oh, how am I going to make these things gel together? And then I was like, well, I'll just do it with what I've got, and then it's been fine. So like Amy was saying, like that's the case, but the proof is in the pudding, right? It's always great to have other inputs, because I think there's often things we don't think about until we see someone doing it, and then we can learn from lived real life examples.
List of questions. Okay, so how do you set up the office flow? So my office is about 900 square feet, I would say. And so I think what I'm going to do is just kind of walk people through it. Yeah. And is that a large office or a small office? I don't know. Here it's kind of small.
I mean, to give you comparison, mine right now is 37 square meters and you have 87.
Yeah, mine's about that too.
Yeah. So I'm walking in, and basically, I don't know if you can see. I don't know how well you can see along the wall there, or it's hard to do it. And actually, okay. Yeah. So I've basically got in the corner the Atlas Orthagonal table, and then I've got 3 other tables in the main room, and I have one small office room so that I can have a private conversation with people at any point. So when I mean, right now we're still in a hybrid transition from COVID, because we're still wearing masks and having to do a lot of different things, and still under some restrictions, but trying to come out of them. So right now I'm working 4 tables. I usually have 6. But I've been slowly introducing 1 table at a time and getting people closer together, just because people are still kind of nervous about all of this. I don't know. Is the attitude similar there right now or no?
Nope, we're done.
Prior to COVID, I would see probably about, I booked 8 people per hour with an overbook of 10. And so I was working 6 tables, and that seemed to be a really good flow. Right now, I only book 3 people per half hour, so 6 per hour. The way that we do things, I have people come in, and I'm working with an assistant right now, which I never did before. I used to have people trained to just come in. They would fill out the first part of their blank soap note, and then they would pick up a face towel and get on an available table. And the way that I did it is they could pick any table, except I had all my tables the same color, except one of my Atlas tables was green. And so they always had to leave the green Atlas table available, because that way I can switch people back and forth to that one table. And that's how I kind of get the flow. So everybody starts by lying face down, and I have their notes. Basically, they've started their notes for me. And so I have it on a clipboard, and I kind of just glance at the notes to see if there's anything important that I need to know that they're updating. And then I just basically establish continuity with each person. So I establish continuity, go to the next table, establish continuity, and then, work my way back and forth, just like you would. And at a certain point, we've got patterns that are starting to come to the surface and defining themselves. If I think that the Atlas adjustment, and when we're talking about it in the office, I say we're adjusting from the Atlas so that we keep the language consistent for biogeometric integration, because people, and if you're an upper cervical doctor, you get the people from all the other practices that come in and say, my Atlas is out, my Atlas is out. I hear this all day long, and we work with it as we can. Some people get it, some people are never going to get it, but I try to use that languaging. And when people are saying, well, I don't understand why I'm out or why I need this adjusted again, that's when I keep the conversation going about patterns. Your pattern wasn't the same today. As you were on the table, your disconnects were in a different place. We went through the breathing pattern. We got you connected. I actually corrected maybe a posterior pattern. And if I do that, I may do it sort of how we're used to at a BGI style, conference, but I also use arthrostims. I use an activator. I have lasers in the office. So I utilize a lot of different equipment, but we always start by establishing continuity and getting that understanding that what we're really, how are we looking at things? How are we defining a subluxation? When I'm explaining, I start with what is it that we do, and I'm just going to read right from the pamphlet, but this question comes up frequently, and before you can make sense of what we do, you must know that what we are paying attention to and how we're assessing someone's body. Chiropractors look at something called subluxation patterns in the body, and traditionally, the subluxation has been viewed strictly in terms of the compression or stretching of nerves in the spinal cord by a misaligned vertebra. And then in bold letters, I say, a modern approach, which is, ideally what we're going to use. So the doctors, and I say, at my practice or whatever, prefer a more modern definition of subluxation, and we recognize it as the interference of optimal expression of your system resulting from physical, biochemical, and psychological distress. This definition of subluxation is credited to the work of Sue Brown, the developer of an integrative approach to the science, philosophy, and art of chiropractic called biogeometric integration. So we're starting to already say, okay, we're looking at this in a more modern way, that we're augmenting and updating the original understanding to incorporate not only the spine and nervous system, but also the body's soft tissue, muscles, ligaments, organs, glands, energetic system. As we go through that, I start to then explain what is geometry, and I say it really, kind of simply, like it's not like what you think it is. It's not the area of a rectangle equals the length times the width. We're looking at the whole geometry, because people oftentimes don't understand what you're talking about when you say geometry. And so I go through a discussion of that, and then I compare upper cervical. And so we get into the conversation of actually looking at, okay, so if you're adjusting from the place of the atlas and you're getting a leg length shift and you're getting, you know, a lot of the upper cervical will do pre and post x-rays. If you're getting a change in shape, that's what we're talking about. And moving the position of the head to the neck affects the whole body. It's not just moving the atlas. And so trying to start to look right from the very beginning of how am I looking at the body, and how am I employing BGI as a language of what I am doing, and not part of a technique conversation so much. So, because in my office, we add using the arthrostim, we add using an activator, we do a lot of different things, but it's really actually easiest if we keep a consistent language. So that's kind of how I introduce people to the idea of what we're doing. And then in the office, the flow really is that people come in, they write whatever their update is for their SOAP note. They get on a table, we establish continuity. And then, like I said, I'm checking for patterns. Maybe they have a posterior pattern. As we're going along, I may ask them to breathe more deeply into a particular area. You know, if something seems a little bit more osseous, I might use an activator or something like that. And then they may stay on the table that they start on as they're processing, because possibly adjusting from the atlas is not the best strategy. But if I need to, I'll switch them to the atlas table and go right ahead with the adjustment from that place. And then the questions always come up with, well, do you use the same listing? Do you do this? Do you do that? If we're using X-ray as a sort of guideline to what or how to adjust, that's all they are. They're a guideline. People change in subtle ways from visit to visit. It is true that I find that more often than not, if somebody adjusts well from, say, the right side, that they, you know, more often than not, they will adjust from the right side. It's not that they never can be adjusted from the opposite side and say like a mirror image approach, but more often than not, the body has a preference neurologically. And if you can tap into that by subtly changing their positioning, then you're completely consistent with being an awesome upper cervical doctor and getting the results by adjusting and using the instrument of your choice, whether you're a hand adjuster or using a, you know, like I use an instrument. And, you know, from that place, a lot of times I just let people rest. I recheck them. And if, you know, if more patterns are not coming to the surface, then they're done. And I would say that most people, we schedule on the half hour. Most people are on the table for about 20 minutes, but sometimes it's longer, sometimes it's much less. Kind of depends what they're showing. And then I just, you know, finish my notes, have them in a pile. At the end of the day, we just literally scan them and then drag and drop them into each person's file. At the front of my office, I have a box with a hole in it that people can either put cash in. I have little envelopes. If they have cash, they put it in an envelope. They can write a check. And we also offer the possibility that they can go into their account. I use Jane as the software program for my office, and they offer an encrypted service for processing credit cards, so they can do that. So they have all their choices. They can be totally self-sufficient in my office. And like I said, I didn't have an assistant until this year, and mostly I have an assistant because he wants to go to chiropractic school. So he's getting some good experience.
Oh yeah, that was my other question. So were you doing upper cervical before you came across BGI, or did you always do BGI and upper cervical together? And if not, when you added in the BGI? Like, what did you observe
So
change?
actually, I took all the BGI coursework that was offered at the time, BGI 1, 2, and 3, before I entered clinic at Palmer, and actually then studied upper cervical, although I will say that what sent me to chiropractic school is an upper cervical adjustment with an Atlas orthogonal instrument. I had had a lot of chiropractic in the past, but when I had that particular adjustment, my vision changed. Like I saw colors that I hadn't seen for the first time. I had broken my neck when I was a kid, and the Atlas instrument was subtle enough to help, and obviously the doctor that I was working with too, subtle enough to get me repositioned. And what I understand now, having gone to chiropractic school, is I'm actually functional when I'm not aligned. So for me, we use the instrument to get me into misalignment, but neurological zero. And, you know, that's something that with the instrument is a little more easily accomplished, just because you're not using touch and feel to guide what you think should be the placement. So I had a background of interest in upper cervical. And when I met Sue, and actually the doctor that I had been adjusted by when I was home visiting just before starting Palmer, because I'd gone to Davenport to take prerequisites, and then I went home for a visit just before starting Palmer. He said, "Hey, you have to meet this woman, Sue Brown. If she ever comes to campus, you know, I've heard all these great things about her. You got to check her out." And he had one of her flyers for BGI up on his bulletin board because he was about to take her class when she came to Seattle, and he hadn't taken it yet. So I met Sue a few weeks later. She had given just a rocking seminar, or not seminar, but she was doing a presentation as part of homecoming, and she wasn't allowed to talk about BGI, which is a crazy thing. So she had, you know, given this whole seminar and not said one word, or it's not seminar, whole talk, philosophy talk at homecoming without saying one word. So I chased her down in the crowd and I said, "Are you the same Sue Brown that teaches BGI?" And she turned around and she said, "Please call me Sue." And yes. And so we got talking, and just kind of, you know, I hadn't started chiropractic school, but she was asking me a few, you know, questions and how I got to school. And I said, well, the doctor, and how I knew her. And I said, the doctor that I had been seeing in Washington had recommended that I try to check out BGI. And she said, "Oh, who's the doctor?" And I'm thinking, how is she going to know? She, you know, she just probably taught this seminar. She probably didn't meet this guy. But evidently, when Sue got to Washington, she was in pretty poor shape. I think she tells, or used to tell the story, and Amy, you probably heard this story. She arrived in Washington after the incident where her computer got run over.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Remember it well.
She went from California.
Sophie, just so you know, that was her example when she would talk about how a track can distort in the body, and she would give an example of, was it on top of the car?
I think the trunk open. I think the back of the car opened, but she didn't see it actually. It was the car behind her, but then nobody showed up at the restaurant to eat with her.
Oh God!
And until later, so much later, and it was Lou.
And this was a time where you couldn't just have your stuff in the cloud, like there was no cloud, and she was incredibly like particular about her computer and her stuff and her presentations. And they got there and they were like, "Yeah, we don't have your computer. It is in a million pieces on the Bay Bridge right now."
Except they did have the computer. They had gone back. They looped all the way around, went back and picked up the pieces. So they had the pieces of her computer as evidence. But because what she said, she realized later after, because she gave this as an example of how one could be subluxated by an overwhelming amount of information. and so when she got adjusted and, you know, came kind of back into her broader sense of things, she realized that she had two friends that had stopped traffic on the Bay Bridge, right? Is that the bridge, the name of the bridge?
Yep.
And stopped traffic to pick up her computer pieces. You don't do that on that bridge. And I guess either Lou or Val said, "Oh yeah, but we're from New Jersey," which particularly struck me when they were telling the story, because I grew up in New Jersey and I thought that was hilarious, because of course, why not? Anyway, Sue arrived in Seattle after that whole incident. It was the next seminar that she had to teach. And I don't know if she actually went from one to the other, or anyway, but she was up in Seattle.
Probably went home.
Yeah, probably went home for the week and then came back, but she wasn't fully herself because she wasn't as prepared as she wanted to be. And so anyway, she arrived, and turned out that my friend Dan was probably the most experienced doctor in the room, and he offered to adjust her. So she had been adjusted by the doctor, the upper cervical doctor that sent me to see her. And so when we found that out, she said to me, "Well, you already know more about chiropractic than most of your, most of the other students that you're going to be studying with." And then she started asking me all these questions about how did he establish continuity, and how did he, I'm like, I'm not in school yet. I don't know. But it turned out, because what she was saying, that he was truly a master. And what he had developed, that Sue and I later discussed, and then actually she and Dan and I actually all were in the same place at the same time at one point, was that he had learned acupuncture to check the acupuncture points. So when he started an adjustment, he would check everybody's pulses, and then he would do his chiropractic adjustment, but he would double check his work by checking everybody's pulses to make sure. So he had developed his own way of making sure that he had continuity and he had somebody fully in adjustment. And that was a lot of what his success was about. He was suspicious that he had his own method, and turns out he did. Yeah.
And so when you started school, were you focused on upper cervical pretty much from the beginning?
I was pretty open, because honestly, I had gotten so much relief from chiropractic when we sort of quote, quote, discovered it. Like when I was a kid, I broke my neck and back at age 6. Nobody even realized it because I had such a bad head injury. So it was a few years later, Carolyn, when I couldn't hold my head up. Yeah, well, I couldn't hold my head up. So the school district required a doctor's signature for me to stay in attendance. And so I went to the orthopedic doctor at that time, and that was the first time they took an x-ray. And they just took one, and they found that I had fractured 2 thoracic vertebrae. Wasn't until much later that we found out that I had actually broken my neck as well. And that was actually Dr. Sweat. When I was at chiropractic school, he looked at my x-rays and said, "You can't have this without breaking your neck." He was like, it wouldn't look like this. And so he confirmed, because he was a chiropractor, but he also had a postdoctorate in orthopedics or something. But anyway, I had a lot of relief from chiropractic when I started getting chiropractic care. So when I was in college, I worked with several different chiropractors, got a job working part-time. And then when I moved to Seattle, I actually did consulting for office, like flow kinds of stuff, so that I could get free chiropractic. And then, and all this time I wasn't thinking of being a chiropractor at all. Went off and did other things. But then it came full circle, and I got the adjustment from Dan. And when everything changed, I literally got up off the table and I said, "Okay, if chiropractic can do this, now I'm going to school." Doing it. Yeah, it just had to be big enough.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit about your time with Dr. Sweat and how that came about, and how long you were with him, and share some stories.
Yeah, it was a real opportunity. And part of it was the doctor that I was mentioning, Dan Lewis, was one of the first doctors actually nationwide to use Dr. Sweat's instrument when it became available to other doctors. He developed Dr. Roy Sweat developed the Atlas Orthagonal adjusting instrument over a period of years that he was testing at his office. So from like 1970 to 1980, he went through several generations of the instrument that's now out on the market, because he tried an instrument that tapped the Atlas. He tried an instrument that used torque. He tried a lot of different things. He designed the instruments, but then had them re-engineered through Georgia Tech to do exactly what he wanted to, and to do all the calculations and all that kind of stuff. So, I through Dan, I had the opportunity, and I actually met Roy Sweat at the same homecoming that I met Sue. I saw him in the, kind of like garden area, and I went over to him and I said, I'm here because of your instrument. And he asked me about the doctor, and then we kept in touch. And so I had the opportunity to work with him for the year after that I graduated. And it was just a phenomenal year of learning and mentorship like they don't offer anywhere, because basically I showed up at 9:30 in the morning and I wasn't done till we were done. And Dr. Sweat, actually in 72 years of practice, never scheduled an appointment. He saw whoever lined up, one person at a time, for as long as it took. And if we were working until 11 o'clock at night, we were working till 11 o'clock at night. That's how he operated.
And how old was he when you got there?
He was 80 when I got there, and he just passed last year. He was 94, and he was working until I think it was 4 or 5 days before he passed.
Oh my gosh, beautiful.
Yeah, 72 years in practice. Yeah.
Incredible.
But the interesting thing about him too is that he, although he is viewed by a lot of people as, a huge authority on the cervical spine, and he has the instrument and he did a lot of the upper cervical research, he always said, use my instrument to adjust the Atlas and be yourself. He did not want to limit his work. He said that actually identifying as an upper cervical doctor is too limiting. And so a lot of people don't understand that about him, because he felt like his position within the profession was to do as much research as possible about how well you could adjust somebody from the Atlas. And so he kept his own practice really restricted to do the research. But he always tells the Atlas Orthagonal doctors, be yourself, And so actually anybody that was not, and anybody that was not part of the research there, I was eligible to adjust. He would oftentimes adjust and then say, okay, Carolyn, I'm going to leave the room, but you do what you do. And let's make sure this patient's getting the best. And so,
Nice.
Obviously within that clinic setting too, you're going to use gentle, you're not, so BGI, the language of BGI was perfect, because I could use, breath, motion, body position, and, just add to the adjustment that he was already providing. So, and he was fascinated by the idea of BGI. We had a lot of conversations, because tensegrity was not a concept, even in engineering, when Dr. Sweat graduated from chiropractic school. So he latched onto the idea, and he kept asking me about it, because he was sure that tensegrity was part of what would explain the leg length difference. And he had always wanted to understand it. And he had, to that extent, he, as a sort of scientifically modeled person, had tried to figure out, he'd hired people to try to figure out what muscles changed position to allow that accommodation. Like, was there a specific chain of response? And they never had an answer. So he really liked the whole idea of the BGI modeling. He wanted to know how to prove it.
Interesting. Now, Sophie, if you are able to unmute yourself and just talk about what you've been seeing in practice over this last week with the leg length, you mentioned that.
Yeah. Well, there's been a few things. So the way I've done it this week is I have just one table, and then I have 3 resting chairs. So I have been having people lay down, face down, I use a tight joint scan. So I scan them first,
Okay.
face down, establish continuity. Then I've been checking for posterior tracks on everyone, and I think I've cleared 1 or 2 on every single person. Then I've had them go face up, and then I'm checking for anterior tracks, which I have to say I'm finding harder to feel at this point, but I'm practicing on every single person. Some people I've done one, some people I haven't, also depending on time. And then some people I've re-scanned at that point just out of pure curiosity to see if something changed or not. I haven't really seen a change in that quick moment because that might only be like a 5-minute difference, right? A lot of people's leg lengths have changed alone. A few people, I was like, based on the scans, they didn't need an upper cervical adjustment, but then everything else has changed from clearing those tracks, like any muscular tension, even though they were clear on the scan, if they were having like tension up through the cervicals, cranials, jaw, like all of that seems to just melt immediately. And then I have them rest either upper cervical, I do knee chest. So I'll either, if they need that, then I'll do that, then resting them. So it's a 15-minute rest in the resting chair, come back, rescan, and then I'm rechecking everyone. And the crazy thing is, like, I've had a couple of people, like really A-type client, can never relax in the rest. I actually thought for a moment she died because I was like, she is so deep asleep. I was having a mini freak out because I tried to wake her up. I was trying to wake her up. So eventually I was like full on shaking her. I took off the headphones. I was like, hey, hey. And then she's like, like comes back to life. And I was like, oh my, she's like, I never fall asleep. And I was like, wow, that is another level, right?
Yeah.
And then I've had people who are way more, let's say, clients who were generally, they've done more energy type stuff in their lives, whatever that might be, right? And they have told me immediately, like, I feel so different in my system already. And then the rest of it, again, they've come back and been like, wow, I feel very different. And for me, the upper cervical adjustment, like sometimes knee chest is a hard adjustment. Like, and I felt like sometimes, what's the word? I have felt sometimes, like, I like the example you were using of Dr. Schwepp saying, like, it's not all, you don't have to just be upper cervical, because sometimes I think the ego comes in and it's like, oh, I have to be this upper cervical person and only do this. But sometimes there's been this feeling that, like, this isn't the best thing for this person right now, but how else can I help their system? But what I felt all week is, because I've established continuity and cleared like a posterior tract or something, when I've gone to do the upper cervical, they've been like butter. Like there's just like this melting feeling, rather than sometimes it can feel like you're fighting against the system, like the system feels like it's like blocking or stopping, or it's not open. So that's been really interesting. Yeah. So that's what I've seen so
Well,
far.
yeah. And I think the more you work with the language of BGI, you're going to pick up on the subtlety of a lot of those tracks and what's going on. And when you're adjusting multiple systems at a time, multiple tracks at a time, finding the nuance of that from any point in the body that you find, that you can adjust from. Because occasionally, in my office, sometimes I'll have somebody that, maybe they have a particularly bad migraine or something, and I've had them on the Atlas table, so I don't move them off the Atlas table. I let them continue to rest. So then I'm effectively without that instrument. Doesn't stop me from adjusting people. I just keep going, and I'm adjusting them, from wherever else is suggested, because you don't have to use that point. I find it very efficient because that's how I see at this point, and I can get a very nuanced adjustment, but you don't have to do it that way.
Yeah.
Right. And deliver a beautiful adjustment.
Yep. And I really feel that now having this in my toolbox feels so more like I can be so much more like truthful or aligned with what I genuinely feel that person's system needs, like rather than going through with the upper cervical because that's all I've got, or like leaning back on some like more basic kind of, you know, Thompson-y type stuff. Like it feels amazing to be able to have such a profound impact on somebody, but in a very, I want to say kind way. I don't know why that word comes to me, but like in a very respectful, kind way. Yeah. So it's exciting to see what. And I had a new
Yeah.
client start this week, so she's obviously never had the like the old way of doing things. So I said to her, "You are one lucky bunny because we are going to get to do all this fun stuff together." And she has just had the most amazing response to her. So I did the BGI and her first upper cervical C1 adjustment, and she has just had like complete symptomatic change. Her scan has held, her adjustments held, like just the best ever. And I was like, what? I mean, maybe that's just her, but I'm excited to see, you know, more new people start. I've got another one next on Tuesday. So let's just see what happens.
Well, and I'll tell you, one of my pet peeves of having, I get a lot of people who've been through upper cervical care for years and years and years. And oftentimes what I do is I tell them on the first appointment that I will be adjusting them from the Atlas position, and that my follow-up appointments are all going to be about freeing up their guidance system so that their body can on its own start to maintain the flexibility and dynamic qualities that are required so that they don't have to have that style of adjustment. And I'll be really honest, there are some people that I absolutely refrain from continuing to adjust from the place of the Atlas until they get it. And so they come in and they have amazing changes because every time they've ever gone to an office, they've gotten their Atlas adjusted or not. And that's the limiting factor for them with chiropractic. So when I tell them that what we are doing is actually going to enhance their abilities, they're in, and the changes that they get are amazing, and they're proud of themselves. And all of a sudden they have a momentum of being the owner of their body, and they're open sometimes a lot faster than people who don't know anything about chiropractic and I have to walk through from step one. So it's interesting because I've had the experience being in practice for quite a while that inheriting people who've had sometimes 30 years of upper cervical adjustment only. And not that again, it doesn't have to be limited, but that's their understanding of it. They may be getting really pristine, amazing adjustments, but in their mind, that's the only thing that is controlling their health. And they're not participants a lot of times. It's they go and get fixed. They're kind of still in that model.
Yeah. And actually that's the like the talking about the model, like having some conversations around, is it called the potential energy theory of subluxation? Yes. I think that's the name.
Yes.
Obviously, I'm not saying that name to my clients, but talking about the concepts with them has just been such a shift and such a liberation. And I feel so excited about it again, instead of that feeling of like, oh, why is someone always subluxated and why this is like a bad thing, and feeling really icky about it. And just I've done a lot of philosophy work, and like I was really struggling with that, and I feel like I still feel like I've got more reading and learning to do around it, but it definitely feels way more expansive than I feel that model, that old way is kind of definitely falling into that mechanistic, reductionistic thing, which we say we're vitalists, and then that just doesn't that's the one bit that doesn't ring true. And I mean, I've still got some
You
figuring
can
out
always
to
talk
do.
about unified theory. You know, unified theory of physics would say it's all part of it. So.
Yeah. Yes.